Awesome.
Hi guys, I'm Paul. I'm going to be a room captain today. Joining me is Alanna. I'm not going to pronounce her name because, again, it's so close to mine that I'm going to mess it up. Alanna today is a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator, and she's in beautiful British Columbia, Canada. She knows what it's like to be us because she has been living with diabetes since she was 9 years old. And today is going to be 5 things I've learned about diabetes and nutrition. So I'm going to hand it right over to yourself. Oh, sorry. And I forgot to mention, there's also a chat feature. And if you have any questions down below, also use the use the question and answer, and we'll be answering the questions at the end.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. So thanks so much to the tech guys here and to Connected Emotion for having me back again to this Slipstream weekend, which I've been, again, I said this morning, so impressed by how well the organizers have pulled this off. It's really, really well done, and so neat to see so many people with type 1 diabetes from across not just the USA, but also across the globe, it sounds like, joining in for this weekend. So hopefully you've learned a few things, and I have been put to this challenge of coming up with the top 5 tips for nutrition and diabetes. So I only have half an hour. Usually I talk for a lot longer than that, so we'll see what I can get through with you guys for today. Here's just my disclosures. I work with pretty much all the insulin pump and sensor companies. I spend a lot of time in type 1 diabetes and technology, all the different companies. So as I said, type 1 diabetes and food, had to sit down and think, okay, what are my top 5 kind of tip subjects that I can talk about today? And we all know this. You sit down to eat and try and figure out an insulin dose, it's a maze. So hopefully I can untackle a couple of these things, but we know it's an incredibly complex topic, much more complex than just what kind of insulin, what kind of pump am I going to get? Food throws us so many curveballs, for sure. So with that, my first key learning when it comes to type 1 diabetes and food is figuring out that mealtime insulin dose is hard. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up over it. It is so difficult to come up with that. Anyone in my session this morning heard me talk about this for an hour with all different types of challenging foods. But basically what it boils down to is there's so many things that impact how much insulin we need to give for that specific meal. So most of us have probably learned how to carb count. If you don't carb count and you've had diabetes a long time, you may just carb count in units of insulin. I know many people that they look at a bagel and they go, that's 5 units of insulin for me. And maybe they're not counting the grams of carbs, but they're counting units of insulin. So whether you call yourself a carb counter or not, you probably actually are counting carbohydrates. So we know our carb count means something. We know what our blood sugar is right now means something. When I'm high, sometimes that dose doesn't work as well as when I'm low, maybe I need to tack more in. Protein, if you think back to your early diabetes education, we're always talking about having a snack with some protein in it so that it can sustain you for longer. That has an impact. Fatty foods throw us a curveball. The timing of our insulin dose is going to make a difference. Activity levels are huge. If anyone was in that exercise talk this morning, you understood how the carbohydrate is used differently when we have activity. So that's going to change our mealtime dose. What time of day it is. Many of us struggle with breakfast. What type of insulin you're on. A food that's high in sugar, maybe it's the glycemic index. Something that's higher in fiber is going to be different. I'm stressed. Everything behaves differently. Who cooked? Where's my trend arrows? What's my portion size? Us lucky females, we have that time of the month where things don't work the same as other times. Alcohol, caffeine is in it. There's a whole bunch more we could add to this. But at the end of the day, you sit down and you go, no wonder when I sit down to give my insulin at a mealtime, sometimes I can feel overwhelmed and not know what result I'm going to get at the end of it. And which exactly leads us to this. Okay, am I going to end up on the left? It's going to be beautiful, bright, and sunny, or is it going to feel like a storm for the rest of the day because of whatever pieces of that puzzle work together differently today? And I think that's just it. No one day is ever the same. You eat the same thing 2 days in a row and get very different results. Very unpredictable from meal to meal often, from day to day, and absolutely from person to person. And I often like to tell people this. It's great to do research on type 1 diabetes and different bolus strategies and all of this and that, but I think anything we read or we hear from people, or my sister has type 1, what works for her is different than what works for me. And that's been very well validated in a number of research that, especially when it comes to nutrition, each of us does respond differently with type 1 diabetes. So that's what makes this really a beast to tackle. So the message to me here is don't beat up on yourselves, right? If you do get that wild swing after and you go, oh darn, I got the carb count wrong, or oh, I did this wrong or that wrong. Well, sometimes it could have been a number of things, and we can't always keep track of all of those little pieces. We just have to do our best. So my second key learning is carb counting. Carb counting absolutely is important. That is a huge determinant to the largest nutrient that has the biggest effect on our blood sugar. But as we just saw, so many other things impact our blood sugar beyond just the carbohydrates. So try your best, but don't stress out too much. And a little bit of, I guess, even before I get into kind of this next section, lots of tools out there I often get asked about. What are the latest apps? What are the extra tools? Calorie King used to be my favorite book. They have an app now, MyFitnessPal. There's even apps here. You can see this one here, this Carbs and Calories that goes by photograph, which is nice. And good old Google, right? But I think a big thing here is even if you've had type 1 diabetes for a really long time and you go, oh, I'm really good at my carb counting, you know what? It's good to stop and look things up from time again. And as silly as it sounds, sometimes it's good to pull out those measuring cups again. That cup of rice quickly turns into 2 cups of rice unless we stop and check, right? So definitely use some of those tools, and it doesn't mean you have to use them all the time, but periodically give yourself a second check just to make sure you're still in the right ballpark. But how accurate do we really have to be? And this is where I'm saying, how much do we have to beat ourselves up? We have some that really want to get down to the gram, every last gram of carbohydrate we're counting. Whereas this other chart here is something similar to what I got when I was diagnosed with diabetes, where we just counted in exchanges. Everything was in 15-gram increments. This is roughly 1 starch, and 15 grams is a slice of bread or half a cup of pasta. And we were a little bit more lenient on things there versus going down to the gram. So what does the research show us, and can we actually set ourselves up for better success by being a little bit more realistic with our expectations for ourselves with carb counting? So this study back from 2015 did actually find that a single mealtime insulin dose could actually cover a range of carbohydrate intake. And what they found was that you could be off on your carb count by up to 20% and still get optimal blood sugar range post-meal. So that to me goes, okay, I can maybe relax on this a little bit. If I miss the 2 grams from my ketchup, or if I didn't quite have that measured properly, or I guesstimated a bit on part of that, you know what, I'm probably going to be okay. Because like, again, that earlier slide I had with all the bubbles, there's so many things that are impacting our mealtime insulin dose that we can't get every single piece bang on. So let's get roughly in the right ballpark. Hopefully that allows you to hopefully relax a little bit. They also found that people who count in 1 gram increments don't actually get better accuracy than those who count in 10 to 15 gram increments. And again, same thing, there's all these other things that impact it. We even know that the food labels have some error in them, and different brand names, different people cooking, all these things can make a difference. But at the end of the day, what I always hope people think about is, what's more important to me? Making a healthy food choice or picking a food that has the exact carb count? And many times I've seen this often, people get so caught up in carb counting, they go, oh, I'd rather take the granola bar because it has the carb count on the label. If I take the banana or the apple or the peach or whatever the fruit is, I have to guesstimate this and I may not get it right. So instead of going for, oh, I need to make sure I get the exact right number, I'd rather you take the fruit and maybe take a bit of a guesstimate on it, look it up, or test later and see and correct if you have to, than constantly relying on packaged foods that do have those carb counts on them. So what about the amount of carbs? Well, we're just on this carb bandwagon here right now. So Adam Brown talks about this in his book, Bright Spots and Landmines. Great resource for anyone wanting some really good practical nutrition tips, trying to flatten their glucose curves, whatever that might be. But he found that eating less than 30 grams at a time really helps smooth his glucose profile. And I can't tell you, I've seen how many patients I've seen who've done something similar and gotten very similar results to that. So absolutely, if we have a little less carb, we don't get that big spike. Certainly, I've seen many people who have these really high carb diets, and I'm meaning like 100 carbs at a time, and they just get this really big spike and can't possibly, even playing with bolus timing, everything, can't control that. And sometimes if you really are struggling with that, bringing those carbs down is going to help. absolutely. And this doesn't mean going full blown no carb or keto or anything like that. This is just maybe minimizing those carbohydrates a little bit. Also, I like to emphasize here, that doesn't mean we have to be putting you on a strict 30 grams at a time diet. It just means, okay, if I can stick to around 30 grams at a time, that's gonna help me have more predictable results. And just know that, you know what, if I'm having a bigger dinner tonight and I have 60 instead of 30 for whatever reason, I'm gonna see different results. And to expect that and maybe tweak my plan a little bit for that night. And why does this work? Again, like I think I kind of explained this here, but less input, less error, right? So if I'm not eating as many carbs, then there's not as much guessing that's going on. But we do definitely have to consider that our blood sugars are affected by more than just carbs. So I've worked with people that have been using ketogenic diets or close to keto diets or very, very low carb, and they're surprised that they still get these big fluctuations after they eat, even without carbohydrate. And that's because the other foods they're eating, if you take carbohydrate in, you're eating a lot more fat and protein, and those have a huge effect on blood sugar as well. So I'm going to be getting into that in a bit here. So my next key learning here is that bolus timing and this matching our insulin to our food is so much more important than you may think. And this is something we've been talking about for a really long time, but one of the probably the most important things, especially when I work with my pumpers, I find many people know this, but it's very hard to put into practice sometimes, and it has a huge, huge impact. So this study is from back 10 years ago, actually, but I'm gonna go over it again because I think we all need the reminder. So this blue line here is showing someone that's bolusing when they eat. So the blood sugar goes up, comes back down. The green line is they bolus 20 minutes after they eat. And you can see it actually is quite similar, that bolusing after versus bolusing at the time. Then this reddish orange line here is that they bolus 20 minutes before they eat. And you can see here that they have a much smoother glucose profile. And certainly I find that when people start wearing any type of a sensor at any time, we see this real time. And we start to realize that, hey, our rapid acting insulin is not fast enough. We really need to give it some kickstart time in order to really get it working and to match that food peak. Now, it is going to vary a little bit depending on what type of food you're eating, but in general, that 20-minute pre-bolus does make a really, really big difference for most people. Really big difference. And I've had some people that are so insulin resistant, let's say in the morning, that they need to back that bolus up even more. So let's test it and watch and see. The only time I find that 20-minute pre-bolus isn't as necessary is in somebody who eats very low glycemic food. So if you eat very high fiber diet, lots of grains, nuts, high protein, things that are really, really slow acting, and you don't see that big spike, especially if you wear a sensor, you don't see that, then maybe you don't need that. But generally speaking, most of us eat on a general mixed diet, do need that pre-bolus. So a big question I get is, please help me pre-bolus. How do I do it? How do I do it? So a few things you can do. I'm a big fan of using the smartwatches or a smartphone to set a reminder for yourself. Many pumps do have bolus reminders built into them, but what I tend to find is that we tend to ignore our pumps. Our pump gives a little beep, we go, yeah, leave me alone. And for me anyways, I like it that my pump beeps when I need to pay attention to my pump. It's not a behavioral thing. So up to you, that's very person dependent, but a cell phone beeping is a little bit harder to ignore sometimes. But the thing that I'm the biggest fan of is just finding where in your routine you can fit that bolus. So I love this little morning routine that I found. I don't know who gets up at 5:45 in the morning for screen time. That's definitely not me. I'm not a morning person, but hey, some do. But if you can kind of think of your routine, what is your most routine time of day? For most people, that's the morning, not everyone. But if you're a morning routine person, you kind of get up at the same time, you have breakfast at the same time. This person always eats breakfast around 7:30 in the morning. So hey, let's backtrack and go, okay, for me to start doing this, I need to bolus after I get out of the shower, just as or before I'm getting dressed. Hook that pump back in, or if you're wearing an Omnipod, keep your PDM in the bathroom, give that bolus, and then you don't even have to stop and think about it. I know for me in our house, I've got 3 young kids that are really busy. So if I wait to bolus, once I step 1 foot downstairs in the morning, I get pulled in a million directions, and there's no way that bolus is going to happen. So for me, it's I get ready in the morning. The second I hit the stairs, I have to bolus. And if I miss it, I'll miss it totally. And then there's always this last resort of finding someone to nag you about it. And hopefully you don't have to get to that. But you know what? Sometimes it's not a bad idea if you have a spouse or a partner or a family member, a roommate, someone can go, you know what? I'm struggling with this right now. Can you help remind me? And kind of have some rules of engagement with that. That was cute. Now, what if you did miss that pre-bolus window though? So we know we're supposed to pre-bolus, we've been working really, really hard at it, and you're starting to see some really nice post-meal flattenings by doing that pre-bolus. Today, morning was crazy. You sit down at the table and you go, oh, I missed my pre-bolus. What am I gonna do? So definitely adding any type of fat or protein is gonna help to slow that down. So throwing in some nuts, a couple of almonds, something to just make that meal not work quite so quickly and to flatten that profile, especially with a breakfast. Add fiber or try something with a lower glycemic index. So something like, again, I'll use these breakfast examples. If you're an instant oatmeal person, something like a steel cut oats is gonna slow it down a little bit more. Reducing that total carb amount. So, oh, I missed my pre-bolus today. Instead of having a big bowl of cereal, maybe I'm gonna have a smaller bowl of cereal and some nuts instead, because I know that my body's just gonna spike too quickly if I have that big bowl. And that's what I'm gonna have to deal with for the rest of the morning, right? And I think that's one thing we know is when we get that big spike, it tends to last and take a while to come back down. We're just making a different food choice overall. The last thing here at the bottom is an interesting one. There have been some studies out on this, a good one from 2 years ago, but they looked at actually food order. So if you're sitting down, this works best for more of like a lunch or a dinner, and you eat your salad and your protein first and eat your carbohydrate last. I'm not a big fan of having to do this every single meal because I think we should be able to just sit and enjoy our meals. I don't want to have to eat in a different pattern just because I have diabetes. But from time to time, especially if I'm going into that meal with a high blood sugar or my Dexcom's telling me I'm double or single arrowing up, I'm going to go, you know what, I kind of want to wait until that arrow turns a little bit before I go and eat all those carbs. So let's start with my salad, my protein, and work on the carbs last, and maybe a smaller portion at that meal on that day. So a couple little strategies to try there. So my number 4 here, this is my longest one. So you might be like, oh, we're at 4 out of 5, we're almost done. But this one here is my longest one, and I spent a big portion of my talk this morning talking about this. But definitely we cannot underestimate the power of fat and protein, and especially those large amounts of fat and protein. They increase our insulin needs substantially and for many, many hours. Feel free on the side here to fling in that chat and put those foods in there that drive you crazy. Those high fat, high protein meals that just hang on, cause us to wake up with that high blood sugar the next morning and really, really difficult to manage. So why does this happen? So I think the first thing is just understanding what's happening in the body when we eat the high fat and high protein meals. So the fat itself often actually reduces the early post-meal blood sugar. So if you can think of some nights, and maybe you've been out for dinner in the time, I don't know where, depending where you live right now, we're not going out to eat for dinner where I am, but you think about when you go out to eat dinner, you have bowls at a restaurant, and but when you're leaving the restaurant, it's like, oh, right, I'm sitting on a really nice blood sugar. And that's because often actually with a high fat meal, we actually drop a little bit initially. We're getting a delayed gastric emptying. So when you think of those really heavy meals, you can feel them sitting in the pit of your stomach for a while, right? Those carbs and your dinner is not being digested quickly. That fat really slows down the gastric emptying. The other thing it does is it decreases our insulin sensitivity. So that bolus we gave isn't going to work as hard as we want it to. And we're going to most likely need some extra insulin in order to get the effects that we want. We also see that these effects last for many hours after we eat. With protein, usually it's in large amounts, we definitely do see late and sustained rise in your blood sugar. And there's a number of different mechanisms for this. The main two are that we get extra glucagon secretion, and there is some glucose that's made from protein. And we end up with delayed and sustained high blood sugars with both of these things. So what else does the research show us about these different types of meals? So this study here a while back looked at 2 different meals. One was high fat, one was low fat. Same amount of carbohydrate and protein in each dinner. The low fat meal was 10 grams of fat, high fat, 60 grams of fat. So that's like having 4 tablespoons of olive oil, just to give you frame of reference there. what they found was that the high-fat dinner, people had more hyperglycemia, more high blood sugar, even though they had more insulin for 5 to 10 hours after the meal. So they already got more insulin, plus they still had more highs. So it still couldn't quite handle it. This year, there was a really nice study that came out, and one of the more current ones, just this January. They looked at different types of fat bolus strategies for different levels of high-fat meals. They actually found the type of fat did not make a difference. This is a question I get a lot. So the saturated and unsaturated fats, they actually didn't impact the blood sugar any differently. This is the first study I've seen that has shown that, so that was interesting to see. But also what they found was that as the amount of fat increased, surprise, surprise, the insulin requirements increased as well. And with that highest fat meal that was 60 grams, they needed 21% more insulin, and they had to give it extended over 105 minutes. Here's a study here that looks at just high protein. So very seldomly do we eat protein alone, but they wanted to isolate the effect of this. And I guess the one real world example of this would be like something like a protein shake. And they found that large amounts of protein consumed alone did cause delayed and sustained high blood sugar for 3 to 5 hours. So that would mean if I have just protein, I actually need extra insulin for it. This one here I like because it puts the two together. So this is back from 2013, looking at some kids and teens. This dotted line on the bottom here is showing a low-fat, low-protein breakfast, and they're studying it for 5 hours. So you can see they actually dropped a little bit. The high-fat alone or high-protein alone are these two in the middle here. The one I want to pay attention to is this upper one here, which is the high-fat, high-protein combined. So at 180 minutes, which is 3 hours, it's definitely beat out the other two. And you can see that there's this long sustained higher blood sugar for 5 hours after that meal. So that's where we definitely see that combined effect of high fat and high protein together. So what do we do about it, right? So I think as a dietitian, should I be saying, oh, it's fine to eat pizza and eat these things all the time? No, but I think that we definitely have to have a place for this. We're social beings. We like to have these things when we like to go out to eat with our friends, order in, take out with our families, whatever that might be. And I think if we don't try and figure out how to do it, it leads to a lot of frustration. And you know what? I don't want to beat myself up every time I have pizza. So there's got to be some ways that we can work around this a little bit. So the oldest strategy we've had around is the extended bolus. And if you've been a long time pumper, you maybe tried this a long time ago and got frustrated that it didn't work. And I think that's because when in the early days of pump therapy, we really didn't, this feature has been around since almost day one. My first pump had an extended bolus in it, but there wasn't nearly the evidence of how to use it at that point until CGM had become better adopted, and we can actually visually see what's happening to people's blood sugars after they eat these meals. So just to kind of quickly go over this, so your normal bolus is given up front here, and then your extended bolus is given over time, and that's what's going to cover those higher fat and those high protein effects the best. So here would be an example of some up front, some extended. But the biggest question I get is, well, how much do you split it? And for a long time, I used to say, we'll do a 50-50 bolus over 2 hours. That was what the very, very, very early pump studies used to show. And we didn't really understand enough about it back then. What we see now, so this study is really nice. They actually found that people needed enough insulin up front to stop having too big of a spike. So if you don't give enough up front, you're going to go high sooner, and then you're going to be chasing it for hours and hours. So they found the magic number was putting in at least 60% up front. And then they found that we actually needed to have at least 70% extended. So if you're looking at this, you're going, hang on, do you really know what you're talking about? You can't even add up to 100%. And that's exactly the point. So this is what supports this idea that we actually need more than a full dose. We need additional insulin to cover those effects of fat and protein, much more than what we just calculate with an insulin to carb ratio. So here, need extra insulin. The trick though here is I can't give you just a blanket answer, because in all of the different studies on fat and protein, we definitely see very, very different results from person to person. So this is where that's exactly where I said at the beginning, we can't just read what someone else did. And I love that, I'm hoping I'm not following the chat right now. some of you are probably sharing some ideas, but what works well for one person isn't going to work well for somebody else. So it's going to be very person dependent. Also, I have to throw this caution out here for sure, because if you've had any type of high activity levels or alcohol, those do cause those delayed low blood sugars. So if you start playing around with using the extended bolus, adding extra insulin on, and you've had alcohol, and you've had high levels of activity, we do worry about that being too much, especially into the night. Okay, so definitely take a word of caution with that. I always say the wine cancels out the cheesecake. So if you're a pump user, what can you do? So you can do a set dose increase. Often I've heard many people talk about doing about a 25% bolus dose increase. This study I'm referencing here talks about anywhere from a 15 to a 35% bolus dose increase, depending on if it's fat and or protein, and doing that as an extended bolus. Definitely consider how much carb you're eating though. If you're having a very low carb diet and you're only bolusing for 10 grams of carbs, then doing a 20% increase isn't going to be enough. So definitely keep in mind how much carb you're eating there and your activity levels and alcohol. I spent quite a bit of time this morning talking about the fat protein unit method, which is a way that you can calculate how much extra bolus insulin you need based on the calories of fat and protein in the food that you're eating. And that sounds like, oh my gosh, carb counting is enough, now fat and protein. But actually, I believe the session I did this morning was recorded. If you want a little more information on that, you should be able to access that. There is information about that on the web as well. A temp basal increase is a really nice, easy one. You go, okay, every time I have pizza, I end up high. Trying to figure out my bolus is too complicated. Why don't I just turn off a temp basal increase? And that can be a really nice one. And you can work it slowly. You can start with a small amount over a shorter time period and then add it and extend it, just keeping in mind that that effect in a lot of these studies is 5 hours or more. Hybrid closed loop systems, if you're fortunate to have one of those, that's going to do just that. It's going to give you that extra bit of basal to help you along throughout that. Or an additional bolus 2 hours later if you totally forgot. So if you go a couple hours later, you know what, I need that extra amount. 670G insulin pump users with auto mode, definitely this is one time I would say go in and put in some more carbs at 2 hours to help mitigate those effects of fat and protein, because that basal will max out. If you're on injections, if you just think about what we were doing with that extended bolus, how can we mimic that? And so could you actually decrease your mealtime dose a little bit, give a little bit extra later to mimic what that extended bolus does? I've also heard of people using shorter acting insulins that tend to last a little bit longer to help with that as well. So something to talk with your healthcare team about. Just quickly here, I think I'm almost out of time, but this study here does talk about, again, for the injectors out there, with a high fat meal, this black line is, they didn't do anything different and they ended up with this sustained high blood sugar like we saw in the other ones. This red line here is they gave an extra dose, 30% more, 3 hours after they ate. And the blue line was when it was a low fat meal. So they really closely almost mimicked a low fat meal by doing that. So another strategy to think about for sure. And what I'd like to close on is a really simple thing. And this was something for me in my first pregnancy. My endocrinologist turned to me and he goes, you know what? Before I had kids, I traveled a lot. I worked long hours, often ate late, different times a day. Everything was inconsistent. He goes, diabetes likes balance and routine. And how simple is that, but how true is that? So way back to those really, really basics, and maybe it sounds boring, but diabetes likes this, right? So regular meals and snacks. If I graze all day long, I'm always in a post-meal state, and I'm never letting my blood sugar come back down. I'm always gonna be chasing it. Same with having something like a balanced plate. So I talked about those effects of fat and protein being very different from the effects of carbs. So if one night I eat a plate full of pasta, and even if I bolus the right amount of carbs, and tomorrow night I have just a little bit of carb and a whopping amount of meat or protein food, how am I supposed to expect similar results just by bolusing for my carbs? It's going to be really, really challenging. So I think the more we can keep consistent and balanced, the more predictable it's going to be. Knowing that, yeah, life is not always predictable, absolutely, and there's going to be days our schedules are erratic, but keeping that in the back of our minds. I had a lady a bit ago that had type 1 diabetes, 57 years, and she ate so consistently by time of day, and she was 20 grams of carbs every meal, and I think her snacks were about 15, and her blood sugar, she was 90% time in range before we put her on our hybrid closed loop system. So remarkable results just by following a routine. And like I say, we can't always do that. And enjoying our food together, right? So I think we should be able to eat what our family is eating. And, you know, for me, maybe it's spaghetti night. Maybe I don't fill my plate with spaghetti. Maybe I have more vegetables on my plate than my kids do, and maybe a little less pasta and some protein than a full plate of pasta, but kind of figuring out a way that you can still enjoy the foods that your family is eating and not having to feel isolated, but feeling that sense of belonging is super important. At the end of the day, try your best, adapt, adjust as you go, try something new. We talk about the fat and protein things. We talk about pre-bolus, saying follow your blood sugar patterns. You know your diabetes best. So keep trying, adapting, moving on, and celebrate when you get those successes, even if it's not exactly where you want to go. If you can get a pizza meal and land somewhere close to your target range, celebrate that. It's worth it. Definitely don't be shy with your diabetes team. My one shout out here would be when you go see your endocrinologist or your dietitian, whoever it is, don't take the perfect days. Find in your Dexcom reports, your Libre reports, whatever system you're using, find that day you ordered takeout or find that day you had that challenging meal and show that to them. Go, listen, this is what happened. Can you help me? And I think a second set of eyes is always a good thing. So that's me wrapping up in a quick 30 minutes. I think I went a little bit over. But if we can stick around a bit, if there's questions, or my email is here. If you want to pop me an email, I'm happy to try and answer any questions. Pass that over to Paul now.
Well, thank you very much, Alanna. I know Ali has a couple questions for you. So Ali, if you want to stick around, actually, then we can ask. It's about, there we go, there, sorry. Where was it? Can you talk a bit more about fat protein for multiple injections? Fat and protein.
Fat and protein for multiple injections, yeah. So that one study I showed did talk about doing that extra bolus at 3 hours later. So if I just kind of slow that one down a little bit. So what we see with the high fat, high protein is that usually it's going to slow down that initial spike. So if you were to give, and it depends on you. So if you notice when you eat something high fat or high protein, you crash in that first 1 to 2 hours afterwards, then I would take your normal mealtime dose and consider dropping it so you're not getting that low. That would be number one, would be preventing that early low if you're someone who experiences that. Not everyone does. And then what that study had showed is that by giving an extra shot of rapid at the 3 hour mark, and in that study they gave 30% extra. So if I gave 5 units with my meal, it will be 1.5 units at 3 hours. Then that basically is creating that extended bolus. The amount you're going to need is going to depend on how different that meal is compared to what your normal is. So you may want to start with even half of that and then work your way up and see how that looks.
Awesome. And I think that's the questions that we have right now.
Yeah, okay. Good, but yes, definitely feel free to email. You know what, did my thing pop off?
There we go. And Nikki also wonders if, what is a hybrid closed loop system?
Okay, so the hybrid closed loop systems are basically any of the insulin pumps that are starting to do a little bit of auto dosing based on the sensor readings. So depending on where you live in the US, there's the Medtronic 670G and the Tandem Control IQ, which are both out. So you still have to bolus for your meals, but then they see if you're starting to creep up later, it's going to increase the basal a little bit and help compensate in between the meals a little bit. Same with if you're dropping low, it's going to pull that back. So hugely beneficial and so much promising technology moving forward with that. Yeah, so read up on that more. There's tons of information on that online. I think Dietitian has an excellent article on the hybrid closed loop insulin pumps.
And I think that's it. So Alanna, we've run out a bit of time. Nikki, there is one for Omnipod, so just take a look at that. Otherwise, Alanna, thank you very much for this. This is awesome. I thank you on behalf of everybody.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, and enjoy the rest of your Slipstream weekend, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks. Bye.